Hi, my name is Donya, and I'm honored to present my capstone on epistemic hegemony in the classroom to you today. So this is Elephant Rock. It's a basalt formation on one of the boundaries of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon, where I was born and raised. It's connected to an ancient, long, complicated story that I can unfortunately only summarize. One day, the animal people were approached by Coyote, who told them that a war was coming and that they needed to leave their homelands immediately and to not look back. All of the animals did as they were told, with the exception of Elephant, who forgot Coyote's words and turned around, and he was immediately turned to stone. If you're thinking right now of Lot's wife in the Bible, who was turned into a pillar of salt by God for looking back at Sodom and Gomorrah, you're not alone. I have heard a lot of people compare the two stories and to read the same moral from both. Elephant Rock is not a story, however, about obedience and about God's will in the same way that the story of Lot's wife is. It's a story about remembering and about what happens when we want to know more than we should. These two ideas are really deeply rooted within Native intellectual history. And if you read this story with an awareness of Native intellectual history, you're going to get the meaning of this story correct. And when I started this project, I wanted to understand where the impulse to mystery comes from. Why is it that we map Western ways of knowing and Western culture onto an object like a story that exists outside of the West? And therefore, why do we misunderstand those stories? And I stumbled upon the term epistemology. And epistemology is a really complicated branch of philosophy that studies what we know and how we know it. Our epistemology is essentially the structure of knowing with which we approach, experience, and understand the world. It's supplied by our epistemic resources, our language, our experiences, and our cultural values, and is so deeply entwined within our culture. So there are epistemic differences between cultures. Western epistemology, for example, sees land as a commodity, as something that can be sold and traded, and values writing over oral tradition. The Native epistemology that I was raised in, however, sees humans as in relationship with the land. So we can no more own a piece of land than we can own a body. And we also understand writing to be a less effective way of preserving what's important about a culture. Within the history of imperialism and settler colonialism, however, Western epistemology has been deemed neutral and superior to other epistemologies, including Native ones. Settler colonial agents have called Native ways of knowing absurd, superstitious, and even less than human compared to Western modes of existence. The way that we relate to land, according to settler colonial agents, somehow makes us animal. This degradation of Native intellectual life allowed settler colonial agents, such as the United States government, to see Native groups as inhuman and therefore to validate the destruction of Native bodies, the elimination of Native ways of knowing, and the theft of Native lands. Take, for example, Celilo Falls. This is a site on the Columbia River in Oregon where Native people, including my tribe, had been fishing, but also trading, celebrating, and praying since, according to our epistemology, before time began. Like Elephant Rock, Celilo Falls is connected to a hilarious and complicated creation story and is really important to Native peoples. In 1957, the United States Army Corps of Engineers built the Dalles Dam downriver of Celilo, and the slack water from the dam submerged Celilo. This site doesn't exist anymore. And when it went underwater, a lot of Native people stopped gathering there. It's no longer the busy cultural site that it is. People don't gather there to fish anymore or to trade or to pray. The site is destroyed. Native fishing rights are protected under the US tribal treaties. That is, the US government can't infringe upon a native's right to fish on our traditional fishing grounds. According to the US government, the flooding of Celilo Falls didn't infringe upon that fishing right. This is because the US government is operating and insisting that we all operate within Western epistemology. Western epistemology understands fishing as an extractive practice. We fish by taking fish out of the water and eating them. The fish still exist at the flooded remains of Celilo, so natives can still fish there. Ergo, the fishing rights, according to the US government, were not violated by the building of the dam. Native epistemology understands fishing as a lot more than extraction, however. To us, fishing requires prayer. It's an acknowledgement of a covenant that requires that we defend the lands and the homes of the fish that we're eating. According to our epistemology, the US government violated our fishing rights because in order to fish, we need to fish at our traditional places. And Celilo is one of those traditional places. So epistemicide is essentially what the US government contributed to when they flooded Celilo. It is the ignoring and destruction of other epistemologies. We commit epistemicide when we belittle epistemologies. We commit epistemicide when we don't acknowledge other epistemologies, when we neutralize Western ways of knowing and insist that they're the only valid ways of knowing worth acknowledging. The US government neutralized their definition of fishing and required Native peoples to adhere to that definition rather than our own in order to build the dam. Epistemicide directly contributed to the physical destruction of Native rights and Native land. There are unfortunately countless examples of this within history. And as educators, we contribute to the process of epistemicide when we neutralize Western ways of knowing in our classrooms and when we map cultural values of the West, languages and histories and morals onto objects that exist outside of that culture, like the story of Elephant Rock. We contribute to epistemicide when we misread stories, when we assume that they can be read through a Western mode of knowing. We contribute to epistemicide when we impose Western cultural values onto our students and define success through Western conceptions of wealth and education. In my project, there's a lot of very personal reflection on the ways that epistemicide has shaped my understanding of success. And this project has been healing in a lot of ways for me because it's required me to reflect on the parts of myself that have assimilated to Western culture merely by doing what I understood through the schools to be the right thing for myself. This project is not prescriptive. It's not attempting to prescribe a solution to the traumas that we're doing to Native students. It's simply trying to prove that those traumas exist and asking that at the very least, as teachers, we try to stop perpetuating them in every way that we can, because when we do perpetuate epistemicide, we are misreading Native stories, but we're also doing harm to our Native students, and we are contributing to a process of violence that has very real, very structural effects. I want to give a huge thank you to Talia Zmock-Bierson, who's been a wonderful advisor this past year, and also a massive thank you to Linda Jones, my grandmother, who lives on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and without whom the knowledge of this project would have been impossible. So thank you very much. And
okay, I think it's all good. Hi, my name is Susie, and my senior capstone project is entitled Questioning the Rule, the Civic Implications of Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports as a Pedagogy of Power. So first, a little bit of background about who I am and why I'm doing this project. So growing up in school, to say the least, I think I did pretty well in terms of my academics and my behavioral outcomes. I was always really succeeding, especially above some of my peers. And I think that is the point at which I started to develop a really positive attitude about school when my peers did not. So I always wondered what it was about the institution of the school that led to these disparate outcomes between me and my peers. I always wanted more education, and a lot of my peers who had worse behavioral and academic outcomes wanted less. It's worth saying that I definitely have some survivorship bias. I'm speaking as a white woman with a high achieving mindset. And even in hindsight, I see how much structural power that comes with. And I even saw that as a young kid. So these types of questions led me to study something called Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, PBIS. It's a federally funded disciplinary framework based in behavioral psychology whose stated goal is to improve social and economic and academic outcomes by reinforcing positive behavior. So it first came about in 1997, was federally funded in 1998, and by 2018, it's used by 28,000 schools nationwide. Now, PBIS is based on B.F. Skinner's famous model of behavioral psychology, which essentially argues that behavior can be explained by conditioning responses to different stimuli. So this is the primary philosophy of practice within PBIS. Basically, PBIS controls student behavior by making rewards more available for following rules than that are available for breaking them. B.F. Skinner famously compared a learner's mind to an opaque black box into which one can gain no insight, which advocates for looking to observable phenomena to explain behavior. So by reducing behavior to an objective, observable science, a metric of success within PBIS is its predictive power. If behavior is knowable, then as a variable, it's controllable. So for that reason, PBIS collects meticulous data on all of its students for use in anticipating what types of bad behaviors they might exhibit later down the road, and then employing preemptive interventions earlier to make sure that they do not occur. I should mention at this point that in part because of behavioral psychology, PBS is incredibly popular. All the way from students to parents to administrators to teachers, people say really great things about PBIS. There are countless studies that talk about how PBIS is successful at reducing exclusionary discipline, which in turn increases academic outcomes. And it even increases it makes more optimistic school climates, all the way from elementary schools to high schools. So people really like PBIS. So in addition to wondering what the big idea is about PBIS, I'm wondering what potential civic implications it has. So first, I'm wondering in this capstone what civic norms and relations of power are upheld or endorsed by the pedagogy of PBIS. And second, I'm wondering in what ways does PBIS pedagogy function as a disciplinary regime, especially as a program that prizes itself on using positive behavioral reinforcements. I'm wondering how that less manifest discipline has a place within its behavioral framework. So in order to perform this critique, I engage in a process called redescription when I take primary sources, so evidence from different PBIS materials. I redescribe it by applying critical and political theory, and then I ask new questions of it. And that's how I get to the point where I can ask civic questions of PBIS. Just a note on my limitations, this capstone does not at all seek to make any causal argument about how schools socialize students to theorize power. Instead, I'm just hoping to draw parallels between the logics and discourses of security, legality, justness, and deservingness and threat perception that we see in school and national communities alike. Okay. So in a critique detailing how power manifests subtly within the PBIS framework to influence students' perceptions of what I just mentioned, legality, justness, and deservingness, I make three primary points. The first point is that PBIS is authoritarian. So first, you can understand that by noting that PBIS is actually highly disciplinary. It renders authority figures infallible and unquestionable, and therefore prohibits students from contributing to the formation of community norms. Still, PBIS expects students to follow these norms blindly. So for that reason, PBIS fails to socialize students with democratic values of community. Second, I discuss incentives in capitalism. PBIS reduces students to reflexes to stimuli in line with the behavioral psychology point of view. PBIS neglects students' social and emotional needs in favor of reward-driven behavioral compliance. And this reward-driven system de-emphasizes moral and interpersonal behavior based on empathy and justice that students should be learning in school. For that reason, PBIS socializes students to form a particular relationship with capitalism and power, where compliance equals reward, and then the accumulation of rewards equals wealth. My final point is that PBIS creates a political economy of abidingness, and in so doing, it makes a dichotomy of good rule followers and bad rule breakers. So PBIS signals that the more rewards or capital someone has, the better somebody is, and the more that they actually deserve. It teaches students to pair deservingness with capital accumulation. And on the contrary, it teaches students to perceive those who don't follow rules as actual potential threats. So PBIS instills in students harmful meritocratic ideals of deservingness and community belonging. So a couple thoughts to wrap up. This is one of those projects that left me with more questions than when I began. But one takeaway I want to bring up is a civic implication of those harmful meritocratic ideals and potentially draw parallels between those and problems we see in society today, like the prison industrial complex, anti-immigrant, anti-poverty sentiment. Next, I hope to ask, what are the short and long-term effects of collecting and using behavioral data to control children, especially as that data is attached to them for their time in school? And next, I hope to ask what systems are in place that keep us from prioritizing humanity over law, and how can we call attention to them as people? So the main question I'm left with at the end of this project is, what if America's students were taught that being a good citizen meant questioning rules before it did questioning rule breakers? So thank you so much for listening, and thank you everybody who helped make my project possible. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.
This project is a curricular investigation of Common Ground, an environmental education charter high school in New Haven, Connecticut. Common Ground differs from classical environmental education programs in its philosophy, audience, and environment. Traditionally, environmental education has been restricted to private outdoors conservation programs in remote areas, which severely limits who can participate in them. Because of this, there has been a huge lack of diversity in environmental education participants and the environmental field as a whole. Common Ground, however, is not only a free public school, removing the financial barrier, but it is in a city, expanding the connotations of environment back to its literal definition, the space around us, including urban areas and removing further questions of access. Common Ground has a strong focus on environmental and social justice, but since its founding in 1997, has struggled to balance this part of their identity with Connecticut state academic standards to achieve high standardized test scores and remain open as a charter school. With this background in mind, that leads me to my research questions. First, how has Common Ground's curriculum changed since the school's conception? How has Common Ground adapted its mission over the years to balance high standards and an environmental justice focus? And how does Common Ground's curriculum and mission fit into the literature base? To answer these questions, I relied on interviews with 4 administrators, 4 teachers, and 5 students, and placed those findings into the context of a literature review. The Common Ground case study sits at the crux of the following areas of study. First, environmental education is about, from, and for the environment, using the physical space to discover information about the environment, develop concern for environmental issues, and learn problem-solving strategies to enact change. Not only did early American philosophies prioritize a classic exclusionary view of the environment, but environmental regulations, burdens, and a lack of inclusion have disadvantaged the poor. Place-based learning uses the local community and environment as the foundation and context for teaching curricular school subjects, often including a strong hands-on experiential learning component. Culturally responsive environmental pedagogy is making sure curriculum is applicable to students and their community's experiences. And finally, the Connecticut State Department of Education holds charter schools accountable based on performance standards in order to maintain their charter, especially standardized testing. While Common Ground did not explicitly root their school model or curricular development in this literature base, their themes and values share many similarities with what experts have found. This brings me to the case study of Common Ground. First, the curricular history. The school was founded in 1997 with a heavy classical environmental focus, no streamlined curriculum, and suffering test scores. In 2002, they were forced to refocus on standardized testing with the No Child Left Behind Act, but in this process had a slight alienation from their environmental curriculum. In 2017, they established a core curriculum that had vertical and horizontal integration of classes with the integrating question of how do we create a just environment for everyone, and they attempt to integrate environmental and social justice with testing practice. There are multiple takeaways that I learned from my interviews with Common Ground teachers, faculty members, and students. First, sense of place is a powerful learning tool. Environmental justice is social justice. Student and community involvement in curriculum building is empowering and culturally responsive. It is possible to learn traditional academic skills in a non-traditional setting. And teaching students how to read, write, and problem solve is environmental justice. There's one quote that I had from a teacher who really summed up kind of the whole ethos of this project and what I learned doing this. He said, "We're walking an interesting line between doing things the same and doing things differently. We don't want to lose the benefits of a traditional education, the reading, writing, and problem-solving features of a school that need to be in place. But on the other hand, we push teachers really hard to do things differently, to do more than what happens in other schools, and that makes us great. That makes us more passionate, more engaged, more relevant, more authentic than many of the schools around us." Thank you.